6 people lay dead in a Bavarian barn for 4 days. Someone was still in the house, feeding the cattle, eating the bread, lighting the oven. The killer had not left. It was March 31st, 1922, on a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, 70 kilometers north of Munich. This is the case of Hinterkaifeck, one of the most carefully reinvestigated unsolved crimes in German history. Over the next 18 minutes, we're going to look at 3 things. First, the warnings the Gruber family heard in the weeks before the murders. The footprints in fresh snow with no return tracks. An unfamiliar Munich newspaper. The maid who quit because she said the attic was haunted. The missing house key. Second, who stayed in that farmhouse for 3 days after the killings and what they did there. And third, why no one was ever charged. For named suspects. 6 decades of interrogations. A 2007 Police Academy reinvestigation. Still no charge. To understand what happened on the night of March 31st, you have to start 6 months earlier, in September 1921. That month, the Gruber family's maid, Crescens Rieger, walked off the job. She had worked at Hinterkaifeck since November 1920. Rieger reportedly told neighbors she had heard strange noises in the attic and believed the house was haunted, though we have her account only at second-hand, repeated through the village in the years that followed. What we can say with confidence is that she left and that the family had no maid for the next 6 months. The household at Hinterkaifeck was small and unusual. Andreas Gruber was 63. His wife Cäzilia was 72. Their widowed daughter Viktoria was 35. Viktoria's husband Karl Gabriel had been reported killed at the Battle of Arras on December 12, 1914. Living with them were Viktoria's 2 children, Cäzilia, age 7, and Josef, age 2. The family lived about a mile north of a small hamlet called Kaifeck. The farm sat behind dense woods. Neighbors were not close. There is one fact about the household that the case files cannot ignore, though we will state it once and move on. In 1915, Andreas Gruber and Viktoria were convicted in Neuburg District Court of an incestuous relationship between 1907 and 1910. Andreas served 1 year in prison. Viktoria served 1 month. For years later, in 1919, Viktoria told her lover, a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, that her newborn son Josef had been conceived through her father's continuing abuse. Andreas was reported, arrested, and released for insufficient evidence. Schlittenbauer agreed to adopt Josef as his own son. This history matters for 2 reasons. It made the family socially isolated in a tight rural parish, and it gave Schlittenbauer, the man who would later find the bodies, a long, complicated relationship with the people inside that house. Now to March 1922. That month, Andreas Gruber found a Munich newspaper on the property he could not remember purchasing. He assumed the postman had lost it. The postman had not. Nobody in the surrounding farms subscribed to it. The newspaper had simply appeared. A few days before the killings, Andreas walked the snow line at the edge of his fields and found something else. Tracks led from the forest, across the fresh snow, to a door at the back of the farm, the machine room. The door's lock was broken. The tracks did not return. Whoever had walked out of those woods had walked into the building and not back out. That same night, the family heard footsteps in the attic above their bedrooms. Andreas zegt. He found nothing. A house key had also gone missing several days earlier. Nobody could account for it. Andreas told several neighbors what he had seen. He refused their offers of help. He did not report any of it to the police. There is one more incident from these final days that survives only through a child. According to a school friend of 7-year-old Cäzilia, the girl had said her mother fled the farmstead the night before the murders, after a violent row with her father, and was found hours later in the forest. We have this only at one remove from a child's second-hand account, and the original record does not name the school friend. But it is in the case file, and the case file is what survives. The strange thing about all of this is not that nothing was done. It is that the Grubers noticed. They knew someone was in the woods. They knew someone had been in the attic. They knew the lock was broken. They knew a key was gone. What nobody seems to have asked in those last days of March 1922 is the question that mattered most. Not who was out there, but who already had a way in. On the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, 1922, a 44-year-old woman named Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She was the new maid, replacing Crescen's Rieger 6 months after Rieger's departure. Maria's sister had escorted her on the walk-in, stayed briefly, and left. Maria's sister was almost certainly the last person outside the family to see anyone at Hinterkaifeck alive. Maria worked one day at the farm. Late that evening, something drew Andreas, his wife Cäzilia, his daughter Viktoria, and his 7-year-old granddaughter to the barn. The original 1922 court commission speculated that restless animals had pulled the family out. Investigators later established a problem with that theory. Noise from the barn could not be heard from the house. Whatever drew them out, it was not the cattle. They were lured to the barn through the stable, one at a time. The killer used a mattock, a heavy farm tool, like a long-handled pickaxe with a flat blade. It belonged to the family. It was found inside the barn. Each of the 4 was struck on the head as they came through. From this point, the geometry shifts from the barn to the house. Then the killer walked across the yard into the living quarters. Josef Gruber was 2 years old. He was killed in his bassinet. Maria Baumgartner was killed in her bedchamber. She had been in the house less than 24 hours. Now to the youngest victim in the barn. The forensic record for what happened next is one of the hardest details in the case to read out, and it is also load-bearing. Without it, the timeline of the killings does not make sense. Court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller performed the autopsies in the barn 5 days later, on April 5, 1922. Aumüller established that the 7-year-old Cäzilia had been alive for several hours after the assault. She had torn her hair out in tufts in the straw beside her. That detail changes the geometry of the night. The killer did not move quickly through the barn and leave. The killer was there long enough for the youngest victim to lie awake in the dark. Now consider the question of how many people did this. The 1922 investigators sometimes wrote of the perpetrator. Sometimes they wrote of the perpetrators, plural. The Wikipedia record uses both. There is no settled answer. 6 people were killed with 1 weapon, drawn out of the house in sequence, 4 to the barn and 2 to the bedrooms. And that is consistent with 1 person who knew the household or with 2 people working together. What we know is that by some hour of the late evening of March 31st, 1922, every adult and every child at Hinterkaifeck was dead. The killer did not leave. Outside, snow still lay in the fields. The lamps in the house were lit. The cattle in the barn were standing in the dark beside 4 bodies. For the next 3 days, someone fed those cattle. In the kitchen of Hinterkaifeck, on the evening of April 4th, the bread bin was empty. The pantry had been opened. The fireplace had been used recently enough that the ash was still warm. The cattle in the barn, standing beside 4 bodies for 3 days, had been fed. This is what has kept Hinterkaifeck in books and reinvestigations for over a century. Not the killing, the staying. Begin with what was eaten and what was burned. When investigators finally entered the farmhouse on the evening of April 4th, they found that someone had consumed the entire bread supply from the kitchen. Someone had cut meat from the pantry. The cattle had been recently fed. The fireplace had been used. None of these were one-day actions. They suggested an occupancy of several days. Now to the witnesses outside, in the order they passed by. At 3 a.m. on April 1st, within hours of the killings, a farmer named Simon Reislander was on the road near a settlement called Brunnen, a short distance from Hinterkaifeck. He saw 2 figures standing at the edge of the forest. When the figures noticed him, they turned away so that their faces could not be seen. Reislander kept walking. He told his story later. That same morning, 2 coffee sellers named Hans and Edward Skarovsky arrived at the farm to take an order. They knocked on the door. Nobody answered. They walked the yard. They noticed the gate to the machine room was open. They left. The next night, April 2nd, an artisan named Michael Plockel passed Hinterkaifeck on foot. He saw smoke rising from the oven chimney. As he approached, an unidentified person stepped out from the house and shone a lantern directly into his eyes, blinding him. Plockel moved on. He noticed something else as he walked away. The smoke from the oven smelled wrong. It smelled, in his words, revolting. Nobody investigated the encounter. Nobody examined the oven. We do not know what was being burned that night. Then there was Albert Hoffner. On the morning of April 4th, Hoffner, a local mechanic, arrived to repair a farm engine. He waited an hour for the family to appear. Nobody did. He worked alone for roughly 4.5 hours. He left. Whoever was in the house, whoever had been in the house since March 31st, was almost certainly inside while Hoffner worked outside. The discovery, when it finally came at the hands of the man who would be the case's first and longest-lasting suspect. On the afternoon of April 4th, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Viktoria's neighbor, her former lover, and the legal father of the murdered 2-year-old, sent his son Johann, 16, and his stepson Josef Dick, 9, to walk over to Hinterkaifeck and check on the family. The boys came back saying they had seen no one. Schlittenbauer then went himself with 2 other neighbors, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. What happened next is the detail every investigator since 1922 has come back to. The men found all the doors of the farmstead locked. They could not get in. They broke through a gate to enter the barn. Inside the barn, stacked together, they found the bodies of Andreas, Cäzilia the elder, Viktoria, and 7-year-old Cäzilia. Schlittenbauer turned and walked across the yard. He went to the front door of the house. He unlocked it without difficulty. Then he went inside, alone, while 2 men stood outside who did not know whether the killer was still in the building. He later said he had gone in to look for Josef. Inside, he found Josef and Maria. A house key had been reported missing several days before the murders. Nobody asked that afternoon who else might have had it. When a Munich inspector, George Reingruber, arrived at the barn on the morning of April 5th, the floor of the threshing hall was already trampled by neighbors' boots. Bodies had been moved. Food had been cooked on the kitchen stove by an onlooker in the same kitchen the killer had used. This is where the case begins its slow collapse. The 1922 investigation was not careless in intent. Reingruber was an experienced detective. The court physician Allmuller performed autopsies the day after the discovery. The skulls of the victims were detached and sent to Munich for further examination. But by the time Reingruber's men arrived on April 5th, the scene was already lost. Onlookers had walked through the barn. They had moved bodies. They had moved evidence. According to the case file, some had even cooked meals in the kitchen, the same kitchen the killer had used. Whatever fingerprints might have remained on the doors, the mattock handle, the bassinet, were gone. And in 1922, fingerprinting was already standard police practice across Germany. Investigators first assumed the motive was robbery. They questioned traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and laborers from the surrounding villages. Then they found a large amount of money still in the house, untouched. Robbery as a motive went away. With no clear motive, they began to build a list of suspects. The list, after 104 years, comes down to 4 names. The first is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a suspect from the first day. He was Viktoria's lover. He had a long, hostile relationship with Andreas Gruber, going back to the 1919 paternity dispute. The doors of Hinterkaifeck were locked when his discovery party arrived, but the front door opened to him without difficulty, and a key had gone missing from the house several days before the murders. He moved bodies at the scene. He went into the house alone with a possible killer still potentially inside. And in 1925, 3 years after the murders, he was found at the demolished farm and asked why he was there. He said the killer's attempt to bury the family in the barn had been hindered by frozen ground. Investigators considered that detail intimate to the perpetrator. Defenders pointed out that Schlittenbauer was a neighbor, that he knew the local soil. He was never charged. He won several civil slander suits before his death in 1941 against people who called him the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. The second name is the Gump brothers. Adolf Gump was named a suspect on April 9, 1922, within a week of the discovery, because of his membership in the far-right paramilitary Freikorps Oberland. The District Court of Opole had already issued a warrant for him connected to the killing of 9 farmers during the 1921 Polish uprising in Upper Silesia. Adolf and his brother Anton were not seriously pursued for Hinterkaifeck until 1951, when their sister Crescentia Mayer claimed on her deathbed that the brothers had committed the murders. Adolf was already dead. He died in 1944. Anton was briefly remanded. The case against him was discontinued in 1954 because his participation could not be proven. The third name is Karl Gabriel, Viktoria's husband. He was reported killed at Arras on December 12, 1914, but his body was never recovered. After 1945, German prisoners of war released early from Soviet captivity from the Schrobenhausen region claimed they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer who had identified himself as the Hinterkaifeck murderer. Some of the witnesses thought the officer might have been Gabriel. Gabriel had reportedly expressed a desire to relocate to the Soviet Union and had supposedly been seen alive after his reported death. Several of the prisoners later revised their statements, and 2 soldiers who had served with Gabriel, Josef Bickler and Nikolaus Haas, said plainly that they had positively identified his body on the field at Arras. The fourth name comes from a different kind of theory entirely. In his book The Man from the Train, the American author Bill James argues that the Hinterkaifeck murders fit the signature of a German migrant named Paul Mueller, who was the only suspect in the 1898 killing of a family in Massachusetts, and whom James theorizes killed dozens of victims across the United States. The signature, James says, includes isolated rural families killed wholesale, the blunt edge of a farm tool used as a weapon, bodies moved and stacked, and an absence of robbery as a motive. James suggests Mueller may have left the United States by 1912, when private investigators and journalists were beginning to notice patterns in family murders across state lines, and reach Bavaria. James himself rates the chances more or less a toss-up, though he writes that there's no real reason to believe that it's not him. On the page in James's book where he names Mueller as a candidate for Hinterkaifeck, he is careful to mark it as the most cautious of the 4 hypotheses, a suspect by pattern, not by witness. The case was officially closed in 1955. The last interrogations were conducted in 1986, when Detective Chief Superintendent Konrad Muller-Thumann retired without charging anyone. And then in 2007, 15 police academy cadets at Fürstenfeldbruck reopened it. The cadets re-examined the original files using modern criminal investigation technique. Their final report praised the meticulousness of the 1922 investigators, but criticized the lack of professional forensics, particularly the failure to take fingerprints, which, again, was already common practice in 1922. The authors of the report independently agreed on a single primary suspect. They declined to publish his name, citing consideration for his descendants. That is where Hinterkaifeck stands in 2026. In a Bavarian archive, for names sit in a file box closed in 1955. In a seminar room at Fürstenfeldbruck, 15 cadets in 2007 wrote a 5th name on a page and agreed, together, to leave it unspoken. Not one of them has written it down since. Go back to the smoke at the chimney. It is April 2nd, 1922. Michael Plockel is on the road past Hinterkaifeck. The oven is lit. He smells something he cannot place. A figure steps out of the doorway with a lantern and shines it into his eyes, and he keeps walking. Inside that house, 6 people are already dead. Outside it, a witness is on the road. Between them, holding the lantern, is the person we still cannot name. What survived is small. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was demolished in 1923, less than a year after the killings, to clear the memory from the parish. During the demolition, a blood-covered mattock was found in the loft of the barn. A penknife was found in the hay. A small concrete monument, the Hinterkaifeck Andakstad, was put up near where the farm had stood, dedicated to the 6 dead. The case file survived. The autopsy notes survived. The 2007 Academy report survived, with one name stripped out of it. The thing that did not survive is the answer. We know the family heard footsteps in the attic in March 1922. We know they saw the tracks in the snow. We know a key went missing. We know Andreas Gruber refused help and did not call the police. We know that on the night of March 31st, a person, or two people, drew 4 members of his family into the barn one by one, and that it took the 7-year-old Cäzilia several hours to die. We know the killer stayed for 3 days. We know someone fed the cattle. We do not know who walked into a house that had been listening for him for weeks and then walked back out. The 2007 cadets at First and Feldbruck wrote a name on a page and did not say it aloud. The case file in Munich is not closed in any meaningful sense, only in the legal one. Some neighbor, or some traveler from the woods, or some man who had once been Karl Gabriel, walked away from Hinterkaifeck on the afternoon of April 4th, 1922, while Schlittenbauer was breaking through a gate to find the dead. He has never been named. He probably never will be.